Mr. President, last week I had the opportunity to travel my state of South Dakota, as I think most senators who were home over the break did. And during the week I was able to be part of a couple of events in my state with former Comptroller General David Walker. Now, I think most people here are acquainted with Mr. Walker. He had a 10-year run as the Comptroller General of this country. He has since started an organization called Come Back America Initiative and has been traveling the country trying to explain to the public the issues surrounding our national debt, high federal spending levels, and their effect on our nation's future. And I would add that he is someone who takes both parties to task. He is an equal opportunity critic. He is very bipartisan in his criticism of the out-of-control spending that exists here in Washington, D.C. But he did point out, Mr. President, the tremendous growth in government which has occurred in the course of our nation's history. In fact, when our country was founded, if you go back that many years to the formative years of our country, and he uses the year 1800 as an example, that government spending made up just 2% of our entire economy. 2% of our GDP was represented by government spending. And today, it makes up almost 25%. And we are on a trend line, a trajectory, where that will rise to 39% by the year 2040. And so you have seen this spike, just upward spike, in the spending, the amount of federal spending as a percentage of our entire economic output. The reason for that is, he at least notes, the continuing increase in spending is primarily entitlement programs. In other words, you've got Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, which now represent about 43%. In 2010, those three programs represented 43% of our total federal spending. But again, that number is geared or set to really spike as we head into the future. He pointed out that we're set to spend more on mandatory programs than we will take in revenue in 2011. So this current year, we will spend more on mandatory programs, which include those I just mentioned, Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid, than all the revenue that the federal government will take in. So that would mean that we can't even afford to pay out the programs, the mandatory spending programs that we have in our budget, not to mention those discretionary programs, which are the other part of our federal budget. And if you look at it in terms of how much we spend today and how much we borrow, we are borrowing about 42 cents out of every dollar we spend. That's the reality that we're faced with. So it's clear that we need to make some reforms, Mr. President, particularly to the entitlement programs, to put them on a more sustainable footing. Further, Mr. Walker shared the results of his Fiscal Fitness Index, which puts the United States at 28th out of 34 developed countries, just behind Italy and just 2 places in front of Ireland. 28th out of 34 countries around the world, developed countries, in terms of our fiscal fitness. Now, Mr. Walker's message obviously is not a fun one. It's not a message that you would expect people to like to hear. It's not a message that promises more spending on people's preferred programs. Yet my constituents were eager to hear this message. Why is that, Mr. President? Well, one, he was honest. He was honest about the size of our problem, about the scope of our unfunded liabilities, about the causes of this deficit, that it is primarily a spending-driven crisis, about the effect of the health care law and health care spending in this country, and about the measures that are needed to cut spending and to bring the budget back into balance. My constituents appreciate that kind of honesty, Mr. President. They appreciate someone telling them the truth, not simply continuing to make promises that cannot be kept. And two, they were eager to hear his message because his message offered hope. He pointed out that if the country adopted a fiscal plan that would bring down our deficits on a level that was similar to the President's Fiscal Commission's plan, our nation's rating on his Fiscal Fitness Index would jump from 28th clear up to 8th place. He showed the attendees that there are a series of steps that we can take to fix Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that preserve these programs, these important programs, without bankrupting our country. And he showed us that if we start now, we have time to make these changes without being forced to make draconian cuts or to hike tax rates. This hope that we can fix these problems is real. and it gives the general public something that they can understand. And that was certainly the case, Mr. President, with my constituents last week. Unfortunately, there was another event that occurred last week, and that was the release of the unemployment numbers. And those numbers did not reflect hope, but instead indicated that we have a long way to go toward fixing our economy. These numbers showed that unemployment had risen to 9.1%. Further, the long-term unemployed increased to 6.2 million people, as those who are out of work are taking longer to find jobs. This long-term unemployment is particularly important for a number of reasons. One, these individuals who suffer from long-term unemployment often exhaust government and personal resources that are available to them. As a result, they are at greater risk of falling into poverty. Further, it indicates that our economy isn't sufficiently dynamic. These individuals could have skill mismatches, or there may simply not be any jobs in their local economy. And finally, the long-term unemployed may see their skills diminish and become less and less attached to the workforce. What this all means, Mr. President, is it will become harder and harder for these people to find a job as they no longer know the latest technologies or no longer have the skills that they developed by years of practice. This creates long-term challenges for our economy to be able to find these individuals jobs. So the question, Mr. President, is how? How do we create an environment where businesses and individuals can be creating jobs? Well, we know that we need to cut spending, to cut our deficit, and to cut unnecessary and harmful regulations. In a recent presentation to the University of Washington, Nobel laureate Robert Lucas pointed out that the possibility of higher taxes, the uncertainty of regulations, and the increasing role of the federal government in health care because of the health care law are all contributors to our slow economic recovery. Likewise, Dr. Lucas speculated that our economy may continue to grow at a slower rate because of the increased regulation, taxation, and spending that is moving us closer to a European welfare state. In fact, Dr. Lucas notes that these European economies have incomes that are 20 to 30% less per capita because of these differences in the size of government. It is clear that this would even further increase unemployment if we continued to move along this path. We can't just continue, Mr. President, with the status quo. We already know that the size of our debt is costing us 1 percentage point in growth every year, which, according to the White House's own economists, is the equivalent of 1 million jobs. In other words, when we sustain the kind of debt load that we have today, our gross debt as a percentage of our GDP, our entire economic output, is over 90%. That means that we're losing economic growth, and that means that we're losing jobs. We are shedding jobs as a consequence of this high level of debt and high level of spending. So we need to grow the private economy, shrink government spending, and cut our debts and deficits. This is the path that will help us on a recovery, help our economy recover, and allow it to create the jobs that are necessary to lower that unemployment rate. And we know that we can do this. There are a number of reforms and spending cuts that we are pushing to attach to the debt limit that's under discussion right now, so that we can make it easier and cheaper for individuals to create the jobs that are so necessary to get our economy back on track and to get people back to work. Now, I would simply mention, Mr. President, there are a number of things that can be done and should be done. Obviously, as I noted, spending and debt and doing something about this year-over-year $1.4, $1.5 trillion deficits, now $14.3 trillion debt that is hanging like a cloud over our economy. We have got to deal with that. And we have an opportunity, as has been noted by the leader earlier this morning, to do that in the context of this debt limit debate that we're going to have. We should view this, both sides, as an opportunity to do something meaningful about spending and debt and to put our country on a path, a more sustainable path, fiscal path for our future. But there are a number of other things that impact the economy today that should be done. One is we have 3 pending trade agreements that were negotiated 3 to 4 years ago. They have been languishing here because the White House will not send those trade agreements up here for Congress to act on. Now, just as to give you an example of what that means to an agricultural state like South Dakota, Colombia is one of those 3 trade agreements, Colombia, Panama, and South Korea, all of which present markets for South Dakota agricultural products. But agricultural exports are a big part of our trade relationship with Colombia. In 2008, we had an 81% market share in Colombia. Today, that is a 27% market share, Mr. President. Could I ask unanimous consent for an additional minute to wrap up?
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
We need those trade agreements approved, Mr. President, to create jobs and to grow this economy. And so I would hope that the White House will follow through on their rhetoric and actually send those trade agreements up here so that we can act on them. It has been 771 days since we passed a budget in this country, Mr. President, and the administration talks about the need to do something about spending and debt, and yet here we are, having gone 771 days without even having passed a budget, the most fundamental responsibility that we have to the taxpayers of this country. If we are serious about spending and debt, we need a budget that sets a blueprint for a more fiscally sustainable future for this country. And we need energy policies that allow us to develop energies to get American energy, to get fuel costs under control, which also impacts in a very direct way our economy and our ability to create jobs. So, Mr. President, the solutions they're out there. They're very straightforward, very simple. We need to have the will to move forward and to address these issues, and I hope that we will, because the American people expect and deserve that we will. And as Dr. Walker pointed out last week in my state of South Dakota, if we don't, we are headed for a fiscal train wreck. Mr. President, I yield the floor.